If you look up interesting ship rebuilds, you'll most likely see one of two examples: the Italian battleships or the Kongo class in Japan. Maybe some lesser known ones, like various upgraded destroyers or cruisers. USS Mississippi, the topic of today's video, probably falls fairly low on the list, even though her rebuild is arguably one of the most interesting, for all that it wasn't combat related. Here you have one of these standard type battleships that remained in service until the 1950s, and a ship that ended up equipped with missiles. This was very much an experimental job, and not at all intended to fight. Mississippi was only ever meant to test equipment for more capable ships. Does that make it less interesting? I don't think so. Let's look at her story now, ranging from the interwar years to her fight against Japan, and then, at the end of the road, a second life as a test ship. That story began on April 5th, 1915, when the ship that would become USS Mississippi was laid down. She was the second of 3 New Mexico-class battleships, right in the middle of the standard type run. As designed, Mississippi displaced 32,500 tons at her normal load. This rose to around 33,500 at full loading. On that displacement, she carried 12 14-inch 356mm guns and 4 3-gun turrets, meaning that each of the barrels could elevate individually instead of in one block like a triple turret. These guns were, furthermore, an improved 14-inch 50 caliber model, a longer gun for longer range and better armor penetration. Mississippi carried 2 turrets super-firing on the bow, and 2 super-firing on the stern in the typical Super Dreadnought style. These were supported by 14 5-inch 127mm guns in superstructure casements. Initially, the design carried 22 such weapons. This was changed when it became apparent that the hull-mounted guns would be of questionable utility. That's why you see plated over casements here. Most of the guns were removed soon after the ship commissioned. To wrap up the weaponry, she also carried 4 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, and the typical, and questionable, 2 submerged torpedo tubes. Armor protection was, for its part, in keeping with standard practice. All or nothing armor covering only the citadel. This consisted of a main belt that ranged from 8 to 13.5 inches in thickness. And finally, all of this could be pushed through the water at around 21 knots, by 32,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts. With that rounding off this section, let's return to service history now. USS Mississippi was launched on January 25, 1917, from Newport News Shipbuilding. Her commissioning would follow on December 18th of the same year, which is actually very fast for a fitting out process. For sake of comparison, New Mexico was launched in April of 1917 and commissioned in May of 1918. USS Idaho, the third sister, was launched in June 1917 and only commissioned in March of 1919. Mississippi was fast out of the gate, although she entered right into quiet peacetime duty. While the Great War was wrapping up, Mississippi underwent her sea trials. This concluded by March 1918, at which point the battleship continued working up and training. This would keep her occupied in the Caribbean for much of 1918 and into early 1919. While she was able to test a turret-mounted scout plane, this was about the most excitement the ship saw in her early service. Even that was a bit of an experiment, since there was no way to recover the plane. It had to fly ashore and find an airfield to land at before being shipped back out to Mississippi. This testing took place in April of 1919. Soon after, on July 19th, the battleship was transferred to the Pacific, where, for the next 4 years, her service would follow much the same pattern: training and fleet exercises, with the odd visit back to the Caribbean. Typical peacetime work, with the exception of Fleet Problem 1 in February of 1923. That saw Mississippi, with the aid of shell-spotting aircraft, sink the old USS Iowa, or rather, Coast Battleship Number 4. as her name had been reassigned to a never-completed South Dakota-class battleship. While this went off without issue, Mississippi would soon find herself with a problem in further gunnery trials. On June 12, 1924, the battleship was training off the California coast. This was going well enough until an explosion rang out in her number 2 turret at around 1 p.m. At the time, it was reported as one of two things: a mishap where a charge was ignited before the breach was properly closed, or alternatively, a flare-back where residual fire ignited a charge as it was loaded. Either way, 45 men and 3 officers were killed, although you also see 44 deaths as an alternative number. The confusion might come from the fact a second explosion happened as the ship returned to port. This was caused by gunpowder left inside the middle gun, which caught fire and detonated. This second explosion killed 4 men who were part of a rescue crew looking for survivors of the first blast. It also launched a shell out that came close to hitting a passenger ship, the Yale. This was already the deadliest peacetime disaster in the Navy to that point. It could have been far worse had that shell hit Yale. In any event, Mississippi went in for repair work. This incident was unfortunate, but not enough to take her out of service. She was back to training for the rest of the 1920s, with the exception of a goodwill tour that took her to Australia in summer of 1925. After that, it was back to the West Coast for the next 6 years. This period was largely uneventful, without any turret explosions or sinking of old battleships. This was so quiet, in fact, that the next major event in her career was a rebuild in 1931. It began on March 30th at Norfolk Navy Yard, and it would continue all the way through to 1933. This was very much a rebuild, not a refit. Not to the extent of the Pearl Harbor rebuilds, and certainly not like the Italians. But it still saw notable changes. The original turbines were torn out and replaced with newer models produced by Westinghouse. These were geared turbines, and coupled with 6 new boilers, it drastically improved the power plant. Mississippi could now push 22 knots on 40,000 shaft horsepower. She wasn't going to break any speed records, but it was a notable improvement. Other changes came to her weaponry. The main battery turrets can now elevate to 30 degrees, increasing the effective range. 2 of the 5-inch secondaries were taken off, along with the 3-inch guns. Those were, in turn, replaced by 8 5-inch 25 caliber dual-purpose guns. The torpedo tubes were also removed at the same time. That said, the most visible change was definitely the superstructure. The old lattice masts were removed, and Mississippi went from basically a Pennsylvania to, wait, this isn't a British ship? All joking aside, the original superstructure was replaced by a large tower bridge. This is a very distinctive New Mexico class thing, as no other standards received the same kind. Larger superstructures, yes, but not of this style. All of these changes, along with additional deck armor and torpedo protection, increased the displacement. This rose to just under 34,000 tons standard and 36,700 at full load. With the modernization done, Mississippi rejoined the fleet. She sailed on training exercises in September of 1933 before returning to California in October 1934. The rest of the 1930s passed much the same as the 1920s, with the battleship training and patrolling off California, with winter cruises in the Caribbean to balance things out. With nothing much of note happening, we can move on immediately to the 1940s. As the Second World War raged on in Europe, the New Mexico-class ships were pulled out of the Pacific. Mississippi and her 2 sisters were, instead, transferred to the Atlantic. This came in May of 1941 when they joined USS Yorktown, 4 light cruisers, and 2 destroyers. This group was transferred to the Atlantic Fleet to reinforce neutrality patrols. As it turned out, Mississippi saw no sign of German ships. She would escort convoys ranging as far as Iceland, but nothing major happened in this period, not even when the battleship stuck around Iceland from September through December of 1941. Because of this Atlantic service, Mississippi and her sisters avoided the Pearl Harbor attack. It also made them the most modern standards, along with USS Colorado, left to the fleet in the aftermath of that attack. Unsurprisingly, she was sent to the Pacific on December 9, 1941. Not that this meant much, because the fast battleships were still more useful as they came online. While Mississippi would arrive back in the Pacific on June 22nd of 1942, she stuck along the West Coast for most of the year. This consisted of more training, along with escorting convoys along the coast. She also had her old secondary battery stripped out, in place of more anti-aircraft guns. That said, it would only be in December 6, 1942 to be specific, that Mississippi sailed out into the Pacific. She escorted a convoy of troop ships to Fiji before returning to Pearl Harbor on March 2, 1943. With that done, the battleship finally got a chance to put her guns to use. She left Hawaii on May 10th to sail to the cold north, specifically to join the liberation of Attu and Kiska in the Aleutian Islands. This would begin a career of hating islands out of existence, as I like to call Pacific shore bombardment. In Mississippi's case, it saw her bombard Kiska on July 22, 1943. This, along with the fall of Attu, convinced the Japanese to withdraw their garrison. With no ships left to fight and no shores to bombard, Mississippi returned to San Francisco. This saw a short refit before she set sail again on October 19, 1943. Her voyage saw the battleship sail to the Gilbert and Marshall Islands for the campaign there, specifically the battles of Tarawa and Macon in November 1943. This saw another mishap on November 20th that was almost identical to the 1924 incident. Mississippi was bombarding Macon when another explosion damaged her number 2 turret. This was almost identical to the previous incident, right down to the turret and number of men killed. In this case, 43 sailors. While certainly bad luck, it still didn't put the ship down. Mississippi went in for repairs and was right back to shore bombardment by January of 1944. The ship shelled Kwajalein Atoll on January 31, 1944, as part of the Marshall Islands campaign. She then bombarded 2 other islands on February 20th and 21st. With that done, the old battleship turned south, sailing to bombard New Ireland on March 15th. All of this work did wear out the guns and machinery, necessitating another overhaul. Mississippi returned home, this time to Bremerton. There she would remain for the summer of 1944. This saw general upkeep work, along with increasing her anti-aircraft battery to 14 5-inch guns. After this was done, the battleship returned to shore bombardment. She shelled Peleliu on September 12, 1944, and continued to do so for another week as the Marines stormed the island. Then she pulled back in preparation for the liberation of the Philippines. In this, Mississippi joined several other old standards as part of the 7th Fleet. This would see more shore bombardment duty, this time of Leyte on October 19th, which is all well and good. However, the real excitement came a few days later. On the night of October 24th, Mississippi joined 5 other standards in Surigao Strait. Those ships were all veterans of the Pearl Harbor attack, leaving Mississippi as the odd one out. She was also using older fire control radar compared to the more modernized battleships. This would see her contribute little to the Battle of Surigao Strait as a result. While the PT boats, destroyers, and cruisers harassed the Japanese force, Mississippi sailed with the other battleships. Those opened fire, with the exception of Pennsylvania, as the Japanese battleship Yamashiro sailed towards them. This would become the last battleship-on-battleship action in history. Mississippi didn't contribute much in terms of actual damage. However, she would go down in history nonetheless. because, after the other ships ceased fire, Mississippi fired off one full 12-gun salvo. Technically after a ceasefire order had already gone out, but this has still gone down in history, as the last time a battleship fired her guns on another battleship. After this action concluded, Mississippi continued to provide support for the Leyte operations until November 16th. At that point, she left the area and sailed to the Admiralty Islands for much-needed rest and resupply, before turning right back around in late December to continue operations in the Philippines. This saw Mississippi bombarding Luzon to support the landings there on January 6, 1945. A kamikaze would strike the ship at the waterline during this. Mississippi just shrugged it off and continued right along, only leaving on February 10th. Repairs to that damage followed at Pearl Harbor before the aging battleship sailed once more to support the Okinawa operations. This saw her arrive on May 6th to bombard yet another island. Mississippi's fire proved particularly effective as she demolished Shuri Castle, a major linchpin in the Japanese defenses. The Japanese would respond, with another kamikaze striking the ship on June 5th. Mississippi once more shrugged this off, remaining on station until June 16, 1945. She would then be repaired in a floating dry dock over the course of July and into August. By the time she left, the war was over, and Mississippi was out of a job. So the battleship would instead join the occupation force in Japan on August 27th, and would then be present for the surrender ceremony in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945. 4 days later, the battleship left Japan and returned home. She would eventually arrive in Norfolk on November 27th. This marked the end of her active service as a warship. Mississippi would soon be assigned as a gunnery training ship, replacing USS Wyoming in this role. Although most of that ship's training crew would transfer directly to Mississippi, keeping their experience in play. This saw most of her main battery removed and replaced, with only the number 4 turret kept aboard, at least at first. As initially converted, Mississippi carried 2 single 5-inch 54 caliber guns, the same kind mounted on USS Midway, as well as 3 twin 5-inch 38 caliber mounts along the starboard superstructure. Smaller weaponry included 2 twin 3-inch 50 caliber mounts and 2 quadruple 40mm Bofors mounts. This version of the ship emerged in 1948, redesignated either AG-128 or EAG-128, depending on the source you use. She would soon go in for a refit again, coming out in 1949 with a twin 6-inch 152mm gun turret in place of her missing number 1 turret. This was the same type used on the new Worcester-class cruisers. There were also plans to replace her number 3 turret with a triple 8-inch model from the Des Moines class. That never happened. Instead, in 1952, the ship became the first missile battleship, if only in a test role. The empty stern barbettes had Terrier missile launchers installed, which were tested in January of 1953. Soon after that, however, the old workhorse was finally decommissioned. She left service in September of 1956 and was sold for scrap on November 28th of the same year. She may not have had the most exciting career, but you can't deny Mississippi put in her work, especially in her final role, showing the way forward for shipborne missile systems. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.